What if you could take a step back and look at the world? Explore the line between certainty and doubt. You are listening to the Illumination Hour with your host, Ellen Stallone. Hi everyone, welcome to the Illumination Hour. It's me, your host, Ellen, and today I have something new, different, and exciting planned. And I have a guest for the first time. My guest is Andrew from Puke and the Gang. He's going to introduce himself, and then we are going to discuss the auto industry. We're going to talk about its infancy, its early years, how cars became manufactured, and then slowly over time, concerns grew about safety. And when concerns grow, that's when Big Daddy State steps in and says, "Don't worry, son, I'll take care of you." Now, this is a two-part audio, so the first hour I will have here for you this week, and the second part you'll get next week. So stay tuned, because we have a lot of content coming up for you, and I hope you enjoy it. It is kind of different than what I usually do. I'm actually not a car person, per se, but I had a lot of fun with this conversation. And just to make you aware so you're not surprised or confused about this when it's happening, but I'm going to be phasing in and out of the conversation. So when I start phasing in to make a comment, you'll hear this. And then when I phase out, you'll hear this. In and out. In and out. I think you get the idea. But I just wanted to add some layers of hard information with actual sources, because sometimes it can sound like we're just talking out of our asses and spewing opinions, but there are reasons for these opinions, and that's why I wanted to leave them with you. All right, thanks for listening, everyone. Now on with the show. So today
Hi, Ellen.
Today I have a special guest with me who's already tried to introduce himself. Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I do a weekly podcast. You can find it at PATG Podcast. Ellen is on it frequently, and if you want to hear the horrible side of Ellen, that's where you go.
The horrible side of me? I didn't know I was that horrible.
Well, I think everyone's horrible on my show.
Oh, it's your show. Isn't it called Puke and the Gang?
Oh, I didn't know you wanted to say those horrible, offensive words on this show. But, yeah, it's 1/3 my show.
Yeah, well, you certainly put in a good amount of adding content to it, for sure.
That's my contribution, is I add content, and everyone else does all the grunt work.
What do you mean, grunt work?
Like the editing and the technical stuff.
Okay, so you're good at, like, putting out your opinions and adding to conversation.
Mm-hmm. But I feel like one of my other co-hosts, Nick, would feel like he kind of drives the show. But I disagree.
I think he guides it.
I think he gets angry at the direction that it goes, but he never steers it back on track.
So is that a warning to all podcast hosts? Is not to get angry with your co-hosts, but to actually be actively involved?
If we didn't get angry at one another, it wouldn't be nearly as good. Or as bad. Depends on how you look at it.
All right, so I guess the anger is key.
PATGpodcast.com.
So, Andrew, one of your favorite topics to discuss, as some PATG listeners might already know, is that you are a self-proclaimed genius and specialize in the topic of cars.
I'm self-proclaimed in a joking way when I joke with you. But I'm a car guy, if you will, and not like the car guy that you see in movies where I have an old Mustang or an old Chevelle and I'm always polishing it and shining it up. I'm a car guy in the sense that I drive cars. I like to race them. I like to drive them. And I like cars that drive well. I don't just love one brand or another. I love cars in general. I love vehicles in general. And with this love comes a horrible affliction where 98% of every thought in my small brain is related to cars in some way or another.
So how long have you been driving cars?
Since I was about 12.
Since you were 12? You got to drive when you were that young?
The first time I drove a car, I was about 5 or 6, and I sat on my dad's lap and steered our van.
I did that too, up the driveway.
Oh, I did it through the neighborhood.
Oh.
And then when I was 12, I learned how to operate a vehicle with a clutch. So late at night, I would push my dad's BMW out of the garage silently and push it out. And then I'd hop in and I'd start it up once it was out of the garage and in the driveway. And I would go drive around within a couple miles of the house.
So when you were 12, were you tall enough to actually
Not
reach
really,
the pedals
no.
and the
I
wheel?
would basically be pulling myself up to the wheel with my arms and like putting my butt on the very front curve of the seat just so I could push the clutch in with all my strength.
So you've been driving for a long time, like...
Yeah, I'm 30
more
now,
than half
so
of your
that's
life.
like 47 years.
So have you had like any accident or trouble or...
Oh, yeah, lots. When I was about 13, I backed my dad's car into a big rock.
Is that how you learned to be an expert driver?
No. It's how I learned to look behind me and back up better. And now I'm an expert backer-upper. Unless something is suddenly positioned behind my car that was unexpected. So not like, oh, I parked my car between some poles and I'm going to back into the poles. No. If I parked my car there, I know where the poles are. But if a car magically arrived behind my car and I didn't realize it, then I'll back right into it. Guaranteed.
So you don't look behind you when you start backing out?
I look in the side mirrors, and that prevents me from hitting most things. But if something magically appears directly behind me, I might not see it. Like my mom's car when I was like 15. I've never had any serious accidents. I've just backed into things.
Like pedestrians?
No, not pedestrians. However, to my credit, I feel like I've driven way more miles than most people have.
How many do you think?
It's got to be in the millions. I drove a tractor trailer for a few years, so that racks up miles pretty quickly. And it also gives you very good spatial awareness. But I feel like to my credit, the ratio of backing into things to miles driven for me is probably much better than it is for most people.
I've heard you say a few times before that you've never been in an accident.
Yes, I've never lost control of a car and went off the road and did any damage or collided with another vehicle. I don't think it's a skill to not have accidents. I guess it is, but I don't know. It's just, I think it's paying attention and knowing how to operate a vehicle and knowing how to control a vehicle.
Okay, so besides driving a tractor trailer, what else as far as like learning how to drive in an expert fashion have you done?
Honestly, when I was 11, I got a four-wheeler, and I spent every waking moment on that thing. And then the few moments that I was asleep, I was still on it. But no, I drove that a lot, and I mastered that thing. It didn't have the highest capability, which just meant to keep up with my friends with their more expensive, bigger, faster vehicles, I had to just take more chances and push the limits harder, which made me become a better four-wheeler operator than them. And, yeah, I just learned the feel of vehicles and the limits of traction and what you can do when the front slides or the back slides or when you go up on two wheels or what have you.
That must have been really nice practice as a young person because you don't need a license to drive those around, do you?
Yeah, you do.
Oh.
Yeah, it's not a fun world if you like vehicles.
So what started you into, like, your entire interest in vehicles?
I really don't know for sure because my parents were not car people. My dad had a couple nice cars in my life, but it's not like he was wrenching on an old hot rod as I was growing up, you know, and I wasn't pretending to be a race car driver when I was 3 years old sitting in his hot rod in the garage. I just envied that when I watched Tim the Toolman Taylor on Home Improvement. But I'm really not sure. I didn't have any friends that were super into it. I was told that my first word was car. I don't know if that's true
cliche.
or not. I can't confirm it, but I used to get Matchbox cars and Hot Wheels cars for toys. Those were my only toys. I didn't have rooms full of toys or a toy box like all my friends did. I just had a bunch of model cars.
Did you choose those toys? Like your parents would take you out shopping and be like, pick a toy, Andrew, and that was all you would pick, or did they just bring them home to you so you didn't really have an option?
No, I think both. I think I would, when I had the option, I picked them, and then I would also get surprised by them, like birthday gifts were cars and Hot Wheels tracks and stuff like that. Both my grandfathers, I guess, had some level of influence on me. My one grandfather just really liked his old man cars, like Lincolns and Mercurys, and he was always very proud that he traded it in every 2 years and got a new one, and was always excited to show off any features it may have had. My other grandfather worked for a dealership for a very long time, so he got the chance to drive a lot of vehicles. He never learned much about them. He just drove them for like 3 hours at a time from Columbus to Pittsburgh, and but he knew what each one felt like to drive from the 30s all the way up to the 90s.
Wow, so he spent a lot of time in vehicles.
Yeah, but he never turned a wrench on one. He never drove one spiritedly.
You know, that's really funny that you say that, because when I was younger, my stepfather had like 5 project cars in the yard that he was working on. And sometimes
no offense here, but if it's in the yard, it's not a project car. It's just what he tells himself to make himself feel better about his rusted old piece of crap that's rotting away in the yard.
Well, that may be your opinion, but he was constantly working on them as projects. And occasionally he would take us out for a drive in the backyard. We would just go in circles really quickly. And
donuts?
Yeah, it was very fun. Well, we'd do donuts one way, and then we'd do like figure eights and then spin around the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lot of fun, but even though there were constantly cars around me being worked on, I never got into it. I was never interested, really.
But now, fast forward 15 years or so, whenever you're in a car and we're doing anything like that, you start wooing like a 5-year-old on a roller coaster.
Yeah, I'm brought back to those childhood moments of being in the back seat, thrown around.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of fun, and I've never doubted that it's fun riding in cars fast. I just never had the interest to research into them all that much.
See, I used to feel that way. I used to feel that it was a lot of fun to ride in cars that were going fast. But over the years, it's developed into a massive fear. I hate riding in cars that are going fast.
So you hate riding in cars, period?
Yes, I hate riding in cars that I'm not piloting. And if the car is going fast and I'm not piloting it, it is a terrifying experience for me, and I despise it.
Why do you think that is? What happened that made you not enjoy being a passenger anymore?
I think I got older and more experienced and better. And whenever I'm not driving, unless I'm with a phenomenal race car driver, whatever the person driving is doing is mostly the wrong thing. I know what's going on too well to be able to enjoy myself.
It turns out that the spirit of competitiveness is what allowed Andrew to develop the skills that he now has.
From the day I sat on a bicycle or a four-wheeler or anything, and I had a friend who was doing the same thing, it's a competition.
Everything's a competition.
When you're a boy growing up and you have friends that are other boys, everything is a competition. Whether it's an arm wrestling match, a game of Bloody Knuckles, which was a stupid game where you slid quarters across the table until you made each other's knuckles bloody. Whether it's video games or vehicles, everything is a competition. And as stupid and as immature as that might sound, I also think there's a lot of value in that. And I think that it pushes people to become better. So my friends and I collectively all became better at things.
You've told me that when you lived in Florida, you would often race against other people there.
Not really race. It was more showing off. But I always wanted to show off better than my friends. And they wanted to show off better than me. And we all developed skills and learned from each other.
So,
and got a lot of experience.
What did you do that gave you that experience, that honed your skills?
Drifting.
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 I've heard drifting talked about before as not really driving, just sliding the car sideways.
No, it's driving in its purest form. I mean, I think it's one of the most skillful things that you can do behind the wheel of a car.
Even more than autocross? Because I know that's what you currently do.
Any type of driving that you're doing, if you do it very well, it takes a lot of skill. Because what separates somebody from first and second place or first and last place in a high-level competition event is tenths of a second between first and last place around a 2-minute course. So at that level, that last place guy, even though it's last place, he's really, 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 really good. It's just the guy in first place had one more really thrown in there. And that applies to everything from drag racing to drifting to rally racing to autocross to road racing and anything in between. But drifting teaches you car control, I think, much better than any other type of driving. Basically, you push the car beyond its limits and force it to go out of control. So beyond the point where most people can control it, you find a happy medium past that point, but before you crash. And you try and stay in that little margin of error zone beyond the average person's capability, but just before death. So you're sliding the rear of the car and trying to maintain that slide for as long as possible. It was a lot of fun. It was insanely fun, and it was a growing sport, and it was something new that no one ever heard of back in 2004, 2005. So to me, it was very cool because I'm a hipster. And I don't like things that everyone else likes. And nobody liked this. And the car culture that I was growing up in was very Fast and the Furious. Lots of bright, flashy lights and loud speakers and crazy paint jobs. And I didn't really care for that so much. I cared about the feeling of going fast.
You didn't care about Fast and Furious?
I mean, I did and I didn't. I love it and I hate it.
For people who didn't actually drive cars, that movie was pretty amazing.
Exactly. For people who drove cars, that movie was a joke. That movie glorified what we call tuners, or more pejoratively, ricers, where basically that movie glorified 16-year-old kids who had a hand-me-down 1994 Honda Civic that their mom used to drive to work every day, and they put a loud muffler on it and some stupid lights. They thought they were awesome. And people who knew cars and drove cars didn't want to be lumped in with them. I knew cars, I was getting to know cars, and I was driving cars, and I almost fell down that rabbit hole and started doing those stupid things to my car when I realized this has nothing to do with driving. So I steered the other direction, and because I almost went down that road, I no longer wanted to associate with those people. I didn't like them. I didn't like the culture involved in it. It was just basically, let's go really fast through traffic, which can be fun, to their credit, but I think it's more fun to...
It also sounds dangerous.
Yeah, it is. But I'm not saying I didn't do dangerous things too. I absolutely did. I would go fast anywhere. I would just prefer there be no traffic. But if there was traffic, then I would go fast, especially if my friend was 2 lanes over going fast through traffic as well. I did a lot of stupid things. Somehow nothing terrible ever happened. I do less stupid things now because I'm going to those official sanctioned events.
Okay, and the official sanctioned events that you're going to now, they're somehow different than the quote-unquote stupid ricer events that you used to go to.
Yeah, stupid ricer events are just car shows. Every Saturday, a bunch of people in Sarasota, Florida would go to the Hooters parking lot and turn up their radios, open their windows, pop their hoods, and stand next to their cars and hate anyone that came in that they didn't know. So I started going there a little bit and made some friends with some cars that weren't all that pretty, like most of the cars there, except I quickly found out that those people with the ugly cars, they're the ones who really can drive.
And what were these ugly cars?
They were old 80s Nissans and Toyotas that were rear-wheel drive. They weren't super flashy, didn't have crazy lights. They were a lot of them were beat up, dented, broken windows, smashed lights. different colored fenders and bumpers, because they were drifters. They went out and found back roads or parking lots to throw their car sideways on, and the best way to learn is by doing, and when you do, you make mistakes. And when you make mistakes, you crash into trees and mailboxes and curbs, and you break things. So you can't have a super fancy, expensive car and be a drifter. So we started meeting up at Hooters and quickly gathering there and then leaving. And a lot of these kids would catch on, like, oh, all those guys with those fast cars that, kind of hang to themselves, they're all leaving. Where are they going? So a lot of these kids started following us and making more and more of a ruckus. So the police started coming because these kids would do stupid things. And we would get chased out of our industrial parks and our back roads quite frequently. And that's also the time that drifting was gaining popularity. But I think most teenagers do things like get arrested and crash and destroy things. We somehow managed to do what we did without having any of the really negative side effects.
So for all of you out there that are worried about encountering a racer on the streets every day and being pummeled over, well, you have one less person to worry about. Andrew no longer races on the streets like most of those other reckless teenagers once did. He now drives in sanctioned events, which have a clear scoring structure. There are rules as to what cars go into what classes and who can participate. So the roads are much safer now. And these official sanctioned events are actually a lot more fun than you would expect them to be. If you're interested at all in driving for fun, look into local car clubs in your area. It's a really good place to start. So, Andrew, these ugly cars that you would run off with in the drift events that you went to, you ended up liking those cars.
Well, they were ugly to a teenage Andrew. But as Andrew matured and started to appreciate the finer things in life, the simplicity of mechanics, the simplicity of design, if you will, the no-frills aspect to racing, those cars became really beautiful to me. I started to think for a while when I was a teenager, I needed the latest and greatest vehicle. Whatever was the hottest thing, whatever was in a movie, whatever
sounds like the typical teenage response.
Yeah, but as I got older, I started wanting these old shit boxes, for lack of a better term.
That's pretty strange. You would think that you would stick with the newest and greatest thing coming out.
Well, maybe the newest and greatest thing cost $35,000 and could be a lot of fun and pretty, but the old shit boxes were $350. For $5,000 more dollars, I could put a lot of go-fast parts on them and make them fun. So I started understanding mechanics a little better and understanding what I was doing with these vehicles dynamically. I understood what I needed to do to make a car do a certain thing, but I never really thought about the physics of it and the mechanics of the vehicle while it was happening. So as I learned more and more of that, I started to appreciate older vehicles, which were cruder, or more crude. I don't know which is the proper way to say it, but they were more crude and simpler and inferior in a lot of ways to new vehicles. But in my mind, they were superior. So I still feel that way, and I like vehicles from many different eras of automotive history. And I think new vehicles have a lot of good things to them, but a lot of horrible things to them as well. So in a perfect world, I would like to be whisked away back to the 70s.
And where would you like to be taken in the 70s?
Oh, in the 70s, Italy.
Why Italy?
Because it's a culture of people who love to go fast. Or France.
So what are you referencing? The culture that likes to go fast?
The car racing culture of the 70s and the car culture of the 70s. The designs of the cars, the simplicity of the cars, the innovation that was happening back then, and the lack of automotive regulation in contrast to today's world.
So that would be your dream. It would be to go back to 70s Italy and hop in a car there and just hang on to that car for how long?
No, I would hop into many cars, and I wouldn't just hang on to them. I would drive them.
Many, because there were so many good cars. So you're not just talking about one specific model vehicle. You're talking about the entire industry as a whole.
Yeah, like I said, I don't have a particular affinity for one brand like a lot of supposed quote-unquote car guys do. If you ever hear someone say, I'm a Chevy man or I'm a Mopar man, just walk away from them and don't ever listen to anything they have to say about cars or anything else for that matter, because they're an idiot. I love cars, and every car company has produced a decent car for the most part that I can say I like that car. And plenty have produced bad ones. But I think in the 70s and before that, cars were much more interesting and had much more passion than they do today.
I want to decode what you're saying here. If you have a particular affinity for one specific type of car, that makes you not worthy of judging?
I'm saying if you align yourself with a brand, it is like some nationalistic badge that you're giving yourself. And it's insane patriotism for a company that maybe has done some very cool things in the past. But more than likely, that company has done some very awful things in the past as well, such as making vehicles that were terrible. Not just subjectively terrible in my mind, but objectively terrible. Making things that were dangerous, making things that were ugly, making things that were stupid, lobbying for laws that were bad for the industry, but helpful to them maybe in the short term.
Well, if we're going to talk about car companies creating vehicles that are dangerous, I believe that back in the early 20th century, most vehicles were very dangerous. I mean, that's the reason that most of these vehicle safety regulations came around in the first place.
Well, also, back in the infancy of hair dryers, most hair dryers were very dangerous too, I'd imagine.
I just have to step into the conversation here and say that Andrew does have a good point. Most new technologies do face certain hurdles that they have to overcome, especially when they're innovating and developing new technologies that haven't been there in the past. But the automotive industry has a very fascinating history with how these safety features have come to be, how they've naturally developed. To help us understand the story, I have an article from America on the Move about the auto safety history. In the 1910s, speeding, reckless driving, collisions, and pedestrian fatalities were new problems requiring new solutions. The first remedies comprised a social response focused on controlling and improving driver behavior. By the early 20s, the National Safety Council compiled accident statistics, held conferences, and sponsored Safety Week campaigns in cities in the hopes that increased public awareness would promote careful driving. Controlling driver behavior through laws, fines, signals, and drunk driving arrests were obvious ways to decrease the fatality rate. Although not necessarily the most successful, Americans were slow to understand the importance of redesigning automobiles to make driving safer. At first, the automobile was perceived as a neutral device that merely responds to the driver's commands and could not cause an accident. But by the late 20s, manufacturers acknowledged that design flaws compromised safety. They introduced a technological response to safety issues, adding shatter-resistant windshields and four-wheel brakes instead of two-wheel brakes. In the 1930s, this approach evolved into a market response as automakers actively prompted new safety improvements, such as steel bodies and hydraulic brakes. Automakers now assured motorists that motor cars were completely safe, and industry representatives contended that improving roads, licensing drivers, and regulating traffic was the key to preventing accidents. Seatbelts, energy-absorbing steering columns, and padded dashboards were not installed, even though all of those devices had been invented by the 30s. In the 1950s, physicians and university professors who were concerned about motorist protection introduced a scientific response to auto safety problems. Crash testing at universities pinpointed the causes and effects of bodily impact inside a car during collision. These studies convinced many people that it was necessary to package the driver and passengers with seatbelts and added dashboards. By 1956, those features were available as options on most new cars. In the late 50s, elected officials studied scientific findings from university crash tests. In the early 60s, many state legislatures passed laws requiring seatbelts or seatbelt anchors in new cars. This movement grew into a comprehensive government response to auto safety issues, which we will discuss more later.
Yeah, it was something that was an option on certain vehicles. So as a customer, if you deem that to be valuable, then you could choose to buy that option.
But why wouldn't that be standard in a car company that actually cared about the safety of its customers?
Companies don't care about anything. Companies have one goal. That's to make money. People within those companies might have different areas of focus. Like there are segments of car companies where people care only about the design. There are segments of car companies where people care only about the bottom line. There are segments where people care only about safety, only about fuel economy, only about performance. But the company as a whole cares solely about making a profit. So don't attribute human emotions to a company. I think that's unfair.
So companies don't necessarily have to care about the safety of their customers, but I believe it was because of this lack of care, or at least the seeming so, that led to the development of national standards for safety.
That very well could be the case, but also I feel that a lack of care would also lead to a lack of sales.
Well, not necessarily. Most people need vehicles to get around. They have a job and people they want to visit and places they want to go explore.
Sure, but if I'm Henry Ford and Dodge is cranking out, or Chrysler, whoever is cranking out vehicles that are very, very dangerous, maybe then I say, hey, I have this collapsible steering wheel. So when you get into a front-end accident, the steering wheel doesn't just smack you in the forehead. It actually folds over so you have more room when you fly forward. Or, hey, here's a padded dashboard, as you mentioned, or a seatbelt. Buy my vehicle. That's why my vehicle's 34 cents more expensive. The Dodge vehicle's $8. Mine is $8.34. I'm pretty sure I'm adjusting for inflation properly.
So you think without the regulations, car companies would have continued to improve their safety standards? I believe that there's existing evidence that car companies failed to integrate the safety innovations into their vehicles even after they came out.
You mean after they developed the safety features?
Yes. So there was no incentive for the car companies to implement these safety standards that have been around for a few years at least.
Okay. So with any new technology, new feature, new development, initially it's usually quite expensive. And again, the company is going to do whatever is most profitable. So at a certain point, that new technology will become more affordable to produce. Therefore, they can make more profit on it by offering it in their vehicles. Now, maybe as a new technology gets developed, it's only offered on the ultra luxo trim Ford Model T, for example. Let's imagine there's your base Model T and then your spruced up Model T. It has a roof and windows. Then there's your fancy Model T. It has a horn. It has a spare tire. It has a sheep wool on the dash. All these fancy safety features and things like that. Electric start. So if people are willing to pay for these things, they will then get them as long as they exist.
Right. So if they do exist and they're not as expensive to implement, such as things like seatbelts, why wouldn't companies integrate them? It seems like they have no reason for not putting them in. That is, until regulations came around and basically forced them to integrate them into the vehicle.
Well, in a lot of cases, car companies used to produce cars for the wealthy. So it was a race to see who could put more content in their vehicles. But over time, as cars became more pedestrian, no pun intended, they started not really competing with features. They started competing with price. Oh, here's our family sedan that's only $24.99. and that's the cheapest family sedan on the market. So why on earth would somebody add another 10 cents to that vehicle's cost if they're trying to outprice the competition? So it's no longer about making a safe vehicle. It's about making a cheap vehicle that you can sell in large volumes. Now, on the other hand, the developments, the technologies, the safety features are being implemented in cars. Let's take Volvo, for example. Volvo, historically, for the past 6 decades, has always been a leader in safety. They've always pushed the envelope with, passenger restraint systems, airbag systems, traction control, anti-lock brake systems, emergency braking systems to take it further into the future, lane departure warnings. All of these things, many of which become standard since then. But it's not like all of a sudden some federal agency said, hey, you have to have anti-lock brakes on your car. And then every car company went, what's anti-lock brakes? No, they're just picking and choosing their favorite features and making it mandatory for all car companies. They being whatever federal agency might be imposing a specific feature or technology on the entire auto industry. And I think to make that feature or technology mandatory, you're going to have car companies lobbying to make that so. So let's say you're General Motors and you've developed some new technology. Okay, you invested $1 billion to develop something new, and it's expensive, and you thought this is going to be great. Our customers are going to love this. So you started offering it on all of your vehicles. However, you quickly found out that, oh, wait a minute, I'm General Motors. For the most part, my customers are not wealthy people. They're average people, and they're not going to spring for the extra luxury options. And I just invested a whole bunch of money in this technology. It's not paying off. Well, what can we do? Let's lobby to make it mandatory. So rather than help ourselves by refining the technology or making it more affordable, we're simply going to force everyone else to pump their money into it as quickly as they can so they get hurt in the process.
So you mentioned earlier that it's unfair to say that companies have emotions or they have an emotional reason for doing things, such as caring for people's safety.
Mm-hmm.
So could it be argued that these regulations were a sort of way to legislate emotion into companies?
I think that's a really great analogy. I think that's absolutely what happened. As soon as these regulatory bodies got any power, no matter how small that power might have been, they are then trying to force car companies to have emotions.
All right, so what I've been able to determine from some of the research that I did before we started the show was that cars were implementing their own safety standards and equipment until the World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations in 1952.
So I'm not really sure what that is. My assumption is that it's a collective, cooperative group of car manufacturers kind of all agreeing on standardization.
Yes, that's exactly what it was, and that started in the United Nations, so it had nothing to do with the U.S., but the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act was enacted in the United States in 1966 as kind of like the U.S.'s rendition of this UN harmonization of vehicle regulations.
A regulatory body.
Yes, and
because there can be voluntary regulatory bodies as well. Like getting back to my racing antics, if you will, there are racing regulatory bodies. It's not a law. It's just, hey, if you want to do this, here's what you need to do to be safe or to not die when you go out there.
But when this was enacted in the United States, the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act was a way to empower the federal government to set and administer new safety standards for vehicles.
Basically, it was a wedge driven into the heart of the American automotive industry that allows the federal government to stick their fingers into it.
Yes, it was the first mandatory federal safety standards for motor vehicles.
And I know I sound like a nutjob conservative, you just wacko, complaining about regulations for very simple safety standards like you mentioned earlier, like dashboards that weren't made out of, a Prussian helmet facing your face as you get into a head-on collision, or, seat belts, things like that. But I'm actually going somewhere with that, so keep keep listening. You'll find out more.
So the way that this was first implemented in the United States was largely influenced by a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, which was written by Ralph Nader. And I believe you know something about this.
Yeah, Ralph Nader is hailed as an American hero, and he has saved countless lives. And this is one of the first instances of forcing the public, at least in the automotive world, forcing the public or a car company to really take a major action in the name of safety. And it all sounds well and good, and it tugs on the right heartstrings. But I think this is a tragedy.
Oh, a tragedy.
A tragedy in that Ralph Nader was so successful going after GM. And I'm no fan of GM, believe me. But what this Unsafe at Any Speed book was about the Chevrolet Corvair. And the Corvair was sort of America's answer to the lightweight, fun-to-drive sports cars of Europe. So there was this car company in Germany called Porsche. They made vehicles that were rear-engine, rear-wheel drive, and they didn't have big, giant motors. They weren't these fire-breathing, tire-smoking monsters. They were lightweight, small sports cars. America at the time, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, cars were just growing bigger. Bigger and bigger and bigger, and to compensate for that size, they needed larger and larger engines. They became fat, so to speak, not only the cars, but the companies as well.
As it turns out, it wasn't only the companies that were getting fat, but also the executives that made the decisions at the office, which Andrew will demonstrate in the second part of this audio with some jowl flapping.
They were just cranking these things out, making cars that were larger, with larger engines, but not really advancing in their technology. They were all look and nothing really under the skin. They were basically a bunch of pickup trucks masquerading as sports cars. Pickup trucks use old technology. That's why I use that analogy. But Chevy, some, ambitious person at Chevy decided that, hey, we want to out-Porsche Porsche. So they created the Corvair, which was an air-cooled, meaning simple, rear-engine, rear-wheel drive car. Now, these cars are particularly tricky to drive.
Yeah, from what I've read, the Corvair can be dangerous because, first of all, it's normal for the Corvair to have the front and rear tires inflated at different levels. And if you don't do that, if you just inflate them evenly, then there's a dangerous understeer that you end up getting. And in part, this is due to the weird way that they built the suspension.
Yeah, a rear engine means all the weight's over the rear axle of the vehicle. And that can be very good when it comes to a sports car. People buying a sports car are very particular about the car they're buying. They go, I want this attribute. I want this handling characteristic. I want this. I want that. A sports car is not a minivan. A sports car is not a car for everyone. It's a car for a particular type of person. However, that's not how the American car was marketed to the public. So the Corvair wasn't being sold exclusively to the enthusiast. It was trying to be an everyman car as well. And that's where it failed on the part of General Motors. And that's where it really became a safety issue. You could buy an equally dangerous Porsche in America, but the only person going to fork over enough money to buy that Porsche has a very particular taste in cars and knows what they're getting into. That's like saying, oh, a motorcycle can be dangerous if you don't keep it upright. Well, guess what? Not everyone's going to buy a motorcycle.
So you think GM was basically innocent in creating this vehicle?
No. I think if it was truly dangerous, then they would have lawsuits on their hands, which they did, for individuals who had uncontrollable accidents that could not have been prevented by the individual. But also, GM would learn from that and then be able to make the appropriate changes to the Corvair, as opposed to get so scared off from it, they would never attempt any crazy thing like a rear-engine car ever again, which they have not.
So they did get scared off from it?
Yes, because of Ralph Nader. He did a great job. He really did.
Well, from what I've read, GM is not completely innocent as far as this incident goes.
Nope. Like I said earlier, car companies do good things, car companies do bad things.
Well, I wonder if you know about this, because I was kind of shocked when I read about this. From Wikipedia, Ralph Nader was first propelled into the national spotlight with the 1965 publication of his journalistic exposé, Unsafe at Any Speed. Though he had previously expressed an interest in issues of automobile safety while a law student, Unsafe at Any Speed presented a critical dissection of the automotive industry by claiming that many American automobiles were generally unsafe to operate. Nader researched case files from more than 100 lawsuits then pending against General Motors' Chevrolet Corvair to support his assertions. The book became an immediate bestseller, but also prompted a vicious backlash from General Motors, who attempted to discredit Nader by tapping his phone in an attempt to uncover salacious information, and, when that failed, hiring prostitutes in an attempt to catch him in a compromising situation. Nader, by then working as an unpaid consultant to the United States Senator Abe Ribicoff, reported to the senator that he suspected he was being followed. Ribicoff convened an inquiry that called GM CEO James Roche, who admitted, when placed under oath, that the company had hired a private detective agency to investigate Nader. Nader sued GM for invasion of privacy, settling the case for $425,000 and using the proceeds to found the activist organization, the Center for the Study of Responsive Law.
Yeah, it's a very cool story, isn't it?
It is. I never expected that a company like General Motors would get involved in such
obviously nefarious things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is back in the day where things could be covered up a lot easier, especially when you're a big giant like General Motors dealing with a piddly little activist like Ralph Nader. However, since then, things have got much less nefarious on the surface, but I think much worse deep down. And in that, General Motors is no longer actively tapping phones of their opponents and sending hookers and blow over to them. They're just using politicians to enforce their will, much like many other car companies. That's the more kosher way to do things, I guess, nowadays.
So why do you think that attempt to discredit Nader failed?
I honestly don't know. I wasn't there at the time. I kind of wish I knew a little more about it, but I just think that Nader was a loud enough voice and had enough political sway in his time to make something happen.
Okay, so cars were becoming more popular. People were driving more. It became more of a regular, everyday activity for normal Americans. And the government felt like they had to step in and help people out because there were so many accidents and fatalities.
The population was booming. The economy was doing well, and the number of people getting cars was increasing greatly. The number of families getting multiple vehicles was increasing greatly. Vehicles were becoming more and more unique and specialized in the coming decades.
There were a lot of standards and institutions, government institutions, that came out of this soon following, such as the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, which are federal regulations which specify design, construction, performance, durability, stuff like that. So this is where the wedge really starts getting driven in. And indeed it does. The Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards are U.S. federal regulations which specify design, construction, things that I just listed, requirements for motor vehicles and regulated automobile safety-related components, systems, and design features. They're the U.S. counterpart to the UN regulations developed by the World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations, which I mentioned earlier, and recognized to varying degrees by most countries. FMVSS are currently codified at 49 CFR and are developed and enforced by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is an agency of the executive branch of the U.S. government, part of the Department of Transportation. It describes its mission as saves lives, prevents injuries, reduce vehicle-related crashes. As part of its activities, NHTSA is charged with writing and enforcing federal motor vehicle safety standards, as well as regulations for motor vehicles, theft resistance, and fuel economy, the latter under the rubric of the Corporate Average Fuel Economy, or CAFE system. NHTSA also licenses vehicle manufacturers and importers, allows or blocks the import of motor vehicles and safety-regulated vehicle parts, administers the Vehicle Identification Number system, develops the anthropomorphic dummies used in safety testing, as well as the test protocols themselves, and produces vehicle insurance cost information. The agency has asserted preemptive regulatory authority over greenhouse gas emissions, but this has been disputed by such regulatory agencies as the California Air Resources Board. Another of NHTSA's major authoritarian activities is the creation and maintenance of the data files managed by the National Center for Statistics and Analysis. But more to the point, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was authorized in the form of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966, which was inspired by the publication of Unsafe at Any Speed, written by Ralph Nader.
Yeah, you could imagine how powerful you could be if you're in government and you're on the side of safety.
Right, because you can't argue against safety.
No. I mean, all you have to say as the person who wants that legislation passed is, how can we assign a dollar value to a person's life? If this saves just one life, then it's well worth the millions or billions of dollars.
These regulations that were being passed, such as in 1964 when lap belts started being required on cars, you think they added millions of dollars to the cost of production for car companies?
No, that seems like a very small drop in the bucket, right?
It does.
A lap belt. But take that lap belt and multiply it by 500,000 units. Then it's a larger investment. Still a very small drop in the overall bucket.
Especially when you're taking into consideration development, design.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of development and design in a lap belt compared to an engine or a suspension. However, we'll soon find that with the advent of crash test standards, all of a sudden that lap belt is a lot more expensive. Because as a car company, if you want to make a change to that lap belt, you want to change fabric manufacturers or buckle manufacturers or whoever it might be, or the way you make that buckle, you then have to prove that car and prove that buckle in a crash test. So you're sacrificing an entire car when you make one little change to that buckle. And while this all seems perfectly reasonable, and for the most part it absolutely is, it's again opening up the door for future regulations. And I think by the end of this show, every single person listening will hear a point where they think, okay, that's unreasonable. Even if you're not a crazy libertarian person, I think you're going to hear something that you think that's a bit ridiculous.
So probably one of the most obvious ridiculous car regulations, one of these things that sprung out of this era of golden government intervention into the car industry, was corporate average fuel economy standards, the CAFE standards. So these are regulations that were first enacted in 1975 after the 73 to 74 Arab oil embargo, which, if I'm not mistaken, was what led to the oil crisis of the 70s. In short, and this is again from Wikipedia, the 1973 oil crisis began in October 1973 when members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries proclaimed an oil embargo. By the end of the embargo in March 1974, the price of oil had risen from US $3 per barrel to nearly $12 globally. US prices were significantly higher. The embargo caused an oil crisis, or shock, with many short and long-term effects on global politics and the global economy. It was later called the First Oil Shock, followed by the 1979 oil crisis termed the Second Oil Shock. The embargo was a response to American involvement in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. 6 days after Egypt and Syria launched a surprise military campaign against Israel, the U.S. supplied Israel with arms. In response to this, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, consisting of the Arab members of OPEC plus Syria and Egypt, announced an oil embargo against Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The crisis had a major impact on international relations and created a rift within NATO. Some European nations and Japan sought to disassociate themselves from the United States' foreign policy in the Middle East to avoid being targeted by the boycott. Arab oil producers linked any future policy changes to peace between the belligerents. To address this, the Nixon administration began multilateral negotiations with combatants. They arranged for Israel to pull back from the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. By January 18, 1974, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had negotiated an Israeli troop withdrawal from parts of the Sinai Peninsula. The promise of a negotiated settlement between Israel and Syria was enough to convince Arab oil producers to lift the embargo in March 1974. Independently, OPEC members agreed to use their leverage over the world price-setting mechanism for oil to stabilize their incomes by raising world oil prices after the recent failure of negotiations with Western oil companies. The embargo occurred at a time of rising petroleum consumption by industrialized countries and coincided with a sharp increase in oil imports by the world's largest oil consumer, the United States. In the aftermath, targeted countries initiated a wide variety of policies to contain their future dependency. So, in 1970, U.S. oil production started to decline, even though we were producing some large gas-guzzling cars. So that exacerbated the embargo's impact. Following this, Nixon named James E. Atkins as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia to audit U.S. production capacity. The confidential results were alarming. No spare capacity was available and production could only decrease. So, because of that, car companies had to innovate, and we had to start producing our own oil. Anyway, back to the story.
Yeah, and also if you just look at the automotive landscape in the United States versus other countries, the United States had much larger vehicles, much thirstier vehicles. They were consuming more fuel than anyone else by far.
Because back then everybody was into giant muscle cars, right?
Yeah, for the most part. And that's what people wanted, that's what people were buying, and that's what car companies were producing for fairly cheap.
How could they produce such large gas-hungry vehicles for so cheap?
Because there's no technology in making things bigger. In fact, it's easier. Making things smaller is what's harder. Think about computers.
So when you make something smaller, you're not only cutting down on mass, but you're also shoving more components into a smaller space, so it has to be more well-engineered.
Yeah, or using better technology, better materials, stronger materials per pound or per gram. You know, a stronger steel versus a weaker steel, or aluminum versus iron for an engine.
The reason that these giant cars were becoming so popular was mostly because they were just being mass-produced.
Yeah, they were affordable, they were inexpensive, and to the uneducated American buyer, man, this 1971 Chevelle with its 350 horsepower, that makes more horsepower than a Ferrari. Yeehaw.
Which sounds pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But from what I'm hearing in your voice, it sounds like you're not a fan of that idea.
No, not really. I mean, I'm thinking about the four vehicles that you and I have put together, and the one with the smallest engine is the fastest car by far. It doesn't have the highest horsepower. It has the lowest horsepower of all the cars, and it's the fastest one. The highest horsepower vehicle is my big truck. That's what these muscle cars were. My big truck can do a big smoky burnout. So can these muscle cars. They can't stop. They can't turn. So for a driver like me, they are a big waste. Sure, they look flashy. They're bright, colored, lots of chrome, lots of noise. Yeah, and at the time it made sense for the American auto industry to do that.
Especially since gas prices were so low, as I understand it.
But also in this time, this kind of spoiled the American auto industry, and they became fat. Again, that term fat for the cars, for the industry, they became unflexible, unadaptable. They couldn't evolve as the market evolved, as the challenges evolved. And this is what led to the decline of the American auto industry in the 1970s. Because when that oil embargo hit, all of a sudden, we have regulations on the emissions of vehicles. And it's way harder to clean up the exhaust of a big, giant American V8 than it is to clean up the exhaust of a little tiny four-cylinder Toyota engine.
Right, so these CAFE standards, which were regulations that were supposed to improve the average fuel economy of cars.
And that went hand in hand with the emission standards that I was just mentioning.
Right, it was also meant to reduce the noxious gases that were coming out of the tailpipes. And for a car that has a smaller engine, which uses less fuel, I imagine that's easier than for a car that uses up tons of fuel and spits out however many more tons of poisonous gases per year.
And not only that, those companies like Toyota and Honda and Nissan, those companies were a lot more flexible. And it was a lot easier to adapt their vehicles and their technology to overcome these new hurdles. Whether it was the regulations being imposed upon them with fuel economy standards, emission standards, or simply the natural market forces of the price of gasoline being expensive. So you have a 4,000-pound American car that was getting 9 miles per gallon. Well, guess what? When you choke it and you try to clean up the smog, it doesn't make the fuel economy any better. So that big American car that is being offered still by Chrysler or whoever it might be is still getting 9 miles per gallon. It's just a whole lot less fun to drive. Whereas the Japanese car, it might be getting 25 miles per gallon. So your average Toyota, your Toyota Corolla from the 70s, weighed a heck of a lot less than your Chevy Nova, which was sort of the small Chevy. It was a big car still. But compared to the rest of the Chevy lineup, it was small. The Corolla weighed half the weight. It had less than half the size engine. So it needed a whole lot less fuel. So when fuel prices spiked, that Corolla is a lot more appealing to the American customer. And all that was appealing about that Chevy Nova is that you could get a Nova with a big block engine in it that could smoke the back tires. But now when we take that 350, 400 horsepower engine in that Nova and we slap a catalytic converter on there to clean up all the exhaust gases, we take all the power away. And that 400 horsepower goes down to 150. And 150 horsepower powering a 3,500-pound car or a 4,000-pound car doesn't do anything.
So, from your perspective, these CAFE standards were dangerous or poisonous to the cars themselves because although they might be cleaning up the air, they're actually making the cars worse as far as performance goes.
There were certainly damages that were done and benefits that were had from this as well.
Benefits? I didn't think you would be able to see any benefits in what came of this.
The biggest benefit I see was basically a big fat slap in the face to the American auto industry saying, wake up, lean yourself out, do something about this. Look how much trouble you're in now. And, maybe it's going to kill off some companies. And it certainly did kill off some companies that were less flexible. But the big three still remained. However, the American public's perception of the auto industry became soured a bit. And all of a sudden, not everyone was looking for the biggest, baddest muscle car. They're looking for cars that are more sensible, or they're starting to appreciate, technology and innovation and different ways of doing things as opposed to shoehorning a larger and larger engine in the front of a car. They're starting to appreciate a more graceful technology coming from Europe and Japan, or technologies, not I guess. So the focus is shifting, and I think for the better.
That's going to wrap up the first hour of the show. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you have thoughts, comments, questions, or want to get in on this conversation, email me at illuminationhour@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. And remember, next week we have the second half of this conversation coming up. So stay tuned for that. It's gonna be huge.
Who's gonna tell you when it's too late? Who's gonna tell you things aren't so great? You can't go on thinking nothing's wrong. What now? Who's gonna drive you home tonight? Who's gonna pick you up when you fall? Who's gonna hang it up when you call? Who's gonna pay attention to your dreams? Yeah, who's gonna plug their ears when you scream? You can't go on thinking nothing's wrong. Who's gonna drive you home tonight? Who's gonna hold it down when